Welcome back. We're getting into the messy question of whether thoughts can actually rewrite who you are. And yeah, the big claim here is that habit, emotion, and belief can even push biology around. Which sounds insane until you hear the way he frames stress as a loop, not a mood. Right, and the wild part is he is not talking about one dramatic breakthrough, he is talking about repetition. That is the part that hits, because everyone wants the movie scene and nobody wants the reps. Everybody wants transformation, but also wants to keep checking notifications every 9 seconds. Exactly, that phone thing is basically a tiny addiction machine posing as a calendar. He keeps saying the body is living in the past when you are stuck in the same emotion. And that is a strong idea because it means the feeling is not just a feeling, it is a program, which is depressing and useful at the same time. The annoying thing is he makes it sound simple, but simple is not the same as easy. Yeah, like when he says self-regulation is the gift, my brain goes, cool, how do I do that on a Tuesday morning? On a Tuesday morning with Slack open and your dignity half gone. But the core idea is actually pretty sharp. If you keep rehearsing the same stress, your body starts expecting it. And then the question becomes, are you choosing the emotion or is the emotion choosing you? Usually the emotion is winning on points. That is brutally honest, but yeah, people do seem addicted to their own familiar suffering. And he connects that to the idea that some people need enemies, bad jobs, or bad relationships to keep the loop alive. That is such a savage observation, because it means they are not just attached to the problem, they are attached to the chemistry. Which is why just telling someone to stop is basically useless. Yeah, nobody has ever healed because a friend hit them with a motivational speech over coffee. He keeps coming back to state change before insight, which I think is the most interesting part. Not information first, state first, then the information lands. That is where I start poking holes, because some of this sounds like spiritual confidence dressed as neuroscience. Fair, but the sneaky thing is he keeps dragging it back to habits, attention, and repetition. And those are not controversial words, those are just annoying words because they demand effort. The meditation piece is interesting too, because he is not selling it as calm vibes, he is selling it as reprogramming. Right, like the goal is to get past the analytical mind and into the operating system. Which sounds very cool until you realize the operating system is you sitting still and not panicking. And most people would rather panic efficiently than sit quietly. That line should be stitched on a pillow. The part I do think is real is his point about environment steering personality back into old grooves. Like if you keep seeing the same people, same rooms, same cues, you are basically handing the past a key. And then people call it identity when it might just be pattern recognition on autopilot. Your childhood kitchen is undefeated, apparently. Dude, absolutely. You walk into your parents' house and suddenly you are 10 years old with a snack problem. But I also think he is making a bigger claim about belief, that it is not the words but the conviction behind them. Like mirror affirmations alone do not do much if the nervous system does not buy in. Which is why the manifestation crowd sometimes feels so flimsy to me. Beautiful sentence, zero nervous system change. Exactly, it is a poster, not a transformation. Where he gets stronger is when he says the decision has to be so real that the body remembers it. That is almost like saying change needs a psychological scar, a line in the sand. Yes, and I love that he ties it to acting beyond body, environment, and time. Though I do think people hear that and then start waiting for some cosmic lightning strike. Meanwhile, the homework is breathing and not opening Instagram first thing. That is the most offensive assignment imaginable. The relapse discussion was probably the most practical part of the whole thing. Because he is basically saying relapse is not mystery. It is unconsciousness returning through a cue. And that cue can be a person, a place, a memory, even a mood shift you barely notice. That is why people think they are weak when they are really just triggered. And that changes the whole tone, because weakness sounds moral and triggering sounds mechanical. Mechanical means you can work with it, and that is actually hopeful. Hopeful, yes, but also annoying because now you have responsibility. Nobody likes hope with a bill attached to it. What I kept hearing underneath it all is that attention is not neutral. If your attention keeps landing on fear, lack, resentment, or threat, your body follows. And that lines up with why constant stress feels so physically expensive. He even goes hard on the idea that a huge chunk of healthcare visits are tied to stress. Whether every number is perfect or not, the bigger point is obvious. Modern life is frying people. We invented convenience and then used it to become anxious in HD. That is actually disgusting, but also true. And then he gets into this collective angle, which I think is where things get more slippery. The idea that enough coherent people can shift reality is fascinating, but also hard to test cleanly. Yeah, that is where my eyebrows go up, because now we are in big metaphysical territory. Big territory, tiny measurement problems. Exactly, but I still get why people love it, because it gives meaning to practice. And meaning is a huge part of why people keep going when the results are not immediate. That is probably the most human part of all this. People do not just want to feel better, they want to become someone else. Or maybe remember who they thought they were before the loop took over. That is a nicer way to put it than I did, but yeah. We should probably leave it there before I start pretending I can meditate my way out of bad habits on command. But that is the point, right? The practice is the whole game, not the slogan. And if you can catch yourself once, you can catch yourself again. Next time, we should get into what happens when belief turns into action in the real world. All right, that is it for this one, and we will pick this up in the next episode. If you are waiting for the easy version, you are in the wrong room. Episode 3 gets into what people actually do when the old self fights back. Welcome back. This one is all about mind, habit, and the body getting trapped in loops. And the wild part is how quickly a thought can start acting like biology. That part always gets people because it sounds mystical until you hear the repetition angle. Right, and then suddenly your personality is just yesterday on repeat. I do think people hear that and go, okay, but am I just blaming my mood now? Which is fair because self-help loves to turn every bad day into a moral failure. But the more interesting claim here is that stress becomes a kind of identity. Like you are not just stressed, you start becoming the stressed person. That is the uncomfortable part, because it means the loop feels familiar on purpose. People really do call their prison my personality and move on. And the argument is that the body keeps voting for the familiar even when the mind wants better. That is the relapse piece, right? The body remembers before you do. Yeah, and that makes the whole thing way less romantic than manifesting posters. No mirror speech is beating a nervous system that thinks it is in danger. That is exactly why the episode leans so hard on practice instead of hype. And practice here is not just repeating words, it is rehearsing a state. Which is a much harder sell because it asks for behavior, not vibes. People love a vibe because it is cheap and spiritually flattering. The big idea is that change has to happen before the environment gets to vote. So if your morning starts with your phone, your day already belongs to somebody else. The algorithm is basically your first relationship of the day. And a pretty needy one, honestly. The interview keeps coming back to this idea that emotional state shapes what you can even hear. That part is sneaky because it means advice can fail even when it is true. Which is why people get so mad when the right answer still does nothing. They are not just refusing it, they may literally be unable to receive it in that state. So the fix is not lecture, it is interruption. A walk, a game, a laugh, anything that breaks the trance. Basically, stop being a hall monitor for your friend's nervous system. Which is impossible for some people because they confuse concern with control. That was one of the sharper points, actually, because love without control is way harder. It is almost more passive in a good way, like model the change instead of preaching it. Still, I wonder how far that goes before it becomes a convenient excuse for passivity. That is fair, but I think the claim is not do nothing, it is do the right kind of something. Something that changes state, not something that just adds more words. Words are cheap, and most people are over-leveraged in them already. Everyone is an expert in their own pain for like 48 hours. The scary part is the addiction framing, because that means people can crave their own suffering. Not because suffering is fun, but because it is familiar and chemically reinforced. That is such a brutal thought because it removes the noble tragedy from it. Yeah, it is way less poetic when resentment is just a habit with an audience. And suddenly your bad mood is not profound, it is just rehearsed. The interview keeps saying the memory without the emotion is wisdom. I like that because it separates learning from reliving. But there is a thin line there because people can use that to dismiss real trauma. True, and I think the better reading is not denial, it is disengagement from the loop. Like the event happened, but the present does not have to keep paying for it. That is actually a compassionate way to think about it. And the body piece matters, because he keeps saying the body does not know the difference. So if you rehearse fear enough, your body starts treating imagination like weather. That is a horrifyingly efficient machine we are driving around in, which is why the morning and evening windows matter so much in this model. He is basically saying that is when the gate is open. Not to sound dramatic, but your brain is apparently a terrible intern at 8 a.m., just clicking whatever is shiny and calling it a plan. And then there is the heavier claim about collective survival and culture. That fear, war, confusion, and isolation are not just personal problems, but social architecture. I get the concern, but that is where the conversation can start sounding a little totalizing. Sure, though the core point still lands, attention and emotion are being managed constantly. And if attention is managed, then belief is not just private, it is environmental, which is a fancy way of saying your feed is messing with your nervous system. Exactly, and that loops back to why he is so obsessed with intention. Not wishful thinking, but a clear decision strong enough to beat the old program. And that is the part people miss because they want the shortcut, not the decision. They want the sequel without paying for the first movie. Honestly, the strongest takeaway for me is that self-change is boring until it is not. Like you repeat, you fail, you notice, you repeat again, and then one day it sticks. And that day does not feel magical at first, it just feels possible. Which might be the most practical spiritual idea in the whole conversation. All right, that is where we will leave it for this one. If your phone still owns your morning, do not act surprised by your life. We will pick this up next time and get into what happens when the old self pushes back. Episode 3 gets into the real battle, where intention meets resistance. Welcome back. We are in the loop now, and this episode is really about habit, emotion, and the body catching up. The wild part is how fast a thought becomes chemistry if you keep feeding it. That is either empowering or deeply annoying depending on your morning. It is annoying because it makes excuses feel expensive. Like if stress is a loop, then your personality is not as fixed as you think. That is the uncomfortable idea running through all of this. The body is not just reacting, it is learning your repeated mood. Which is rude, honestly, because it remembers the worst version of you. And then acts like that is your brand identity. What struck me most is the claim that people can become addicted to negative emotion itself. Not addicted to drama in a cute internet way, but chemically attached to the state. Because the anger, the resentment, the fear, they become familiar before they become harmful. Familiar is such a trap. That is why people keep picking the same fight, the same job, the same relationship. Not because they love it, but because their system knows how to live there. And then they call it destiny. That is the most expensive label in the world. The other huge idea here is that insight does not land if the emotional state is wrong. So you can give somebody the correct answer and they still cannot hear it. Which is honestly why advice can feel like an attack. Half the time people do not need a speech, they need a walk. Or a game or a trip or something that breaks the trance. I liked that push toward action because it makes love look practical instead of poetic. Like help someone change their state first, then talk if you must. That is probably better friendship than constant fixing. Which is painful for the fixer types because they love a heroic rescue mission. Guilty as charged, in spirit at least. But the conversation gets sharper when it moves from personal habit to culture. The argument is basically that a society living in fear becomes easy to manage. Attention follows emotion, and emotion follows survival. If people are confused, angry, and isolated, they are easier to steer. That is a dark thought, but it does connect a lot of dots. And the opposite idea is that coherence matters more than numbers. Not the biggest crowd, but the most aligned mind. That is a fascinating claim, because it makes interstate feel collective. It says your private regulation is not actually private. Your nervous system is part of the room before you even speak. So the vibe was science all along, apparently. The stress discussion is where it gets really grounded because that part is less mystical. The body cannot live in emergency mode forever and pretend it is fine. We know that, we just keep acting surprised by burnout. And the idea that a coworker can trigger the same machinery as a predator is brutal. Modern life really did replace the tiger with email, which somehow feels less noble but more exhausting. I also think the memory point is important, because people narrate their pain like it is a courtroom transcript. But if emotion colors memory, then the story is never just the story. That does not mean pain is fake, but it does mean repetition can distort it, which is uncomfortable because we all use our past to justify our present. The part about relapse being unconscious felt especially real, because people think they failed morally when they often just got triggered. Same place, same person, same smell, same mood, and suddenly the old self is back. That is not weakness. That is conditioning working exactly as designed. And if you do not rehearse the new response, the old one wins automatically. That is why the practical advice was so repetitive on purpose. Wake up, choose, rehearse, feel, repeat, and do not wait for inspiration. Terrible news for everyone who wanted enlightenment to arrive like a delivery app. The mirror talk skepticism also landed for me because repetition without embodiment is cheap. Saying powerful words while your body still believes the opposite is basically theater. Very inspirational theater, but still theater. Exactly. And the body is the toughest critic in the room. What he keeps returning to is that change needs an actual decision with weight behind it. Not a vibe, not a wish, but a moment your system cannot forget. The whole body has to believe the turn is real. That is why pain sometimes becomes the doorway, because it makes indecision impossible. Nobody likes that part, but it is very believable. The practical morning routine advice was probably the least glamorous and most useful thing here. Do not grab the phone first. Do not feed the old circuit first. Do not drift first. Sit still, choose the day, and make the inner move before the outer noise. It sounds simple until you realize how addicted people are to interruption. And notifications are basically little emotional casino bells. I think the episode keeps asking the same hard question in different ways. Are you living from your intention, or just from whatever your body remembers first? That is such a brutal mirror. And maybe that is why the whole thing works as a challenge instead of a comfort. All right, that is the real core of this one for me. If your life keeps auto-loading the same emotion, the problem may not be luck. Episode 3 gets into what happens when resistance shows up and the old self fights back. We will pick that fight up next time. Welcome back, because this one gets wild fast. We are in thoughts, habits, and that hidden loop between emotion and biology. And honestly, the crazy part is that he keeps saying the body remembers before you do. That is such an annoying sentence if you are trying to feel in control. But it also explains why people can swear they changed and then snap back overnight. Right, because the environment hits a button and the old self starts driving again. So the phone, the parents, the coworker, the city, all just become little memory machines. Little memory machines is brutal, but yes, basically that. What he is really arguing is that your personality is often just repeated chemistry. And once you hear that, the whole addiction idea gets bigger than sugar or dopamine. He is saying people can get hooked on anger, guilt, resentment, even hopelessness. Which is such a depressing club, but yeah, I get it. Because if the emotion feels familiar, the brain keeps calling it home. That is the part that makes people defend the thing that is hurting them. They are loyal to their suffering like it paid rent. Bro, that is exactly the problem, and it is so human. And he keeps making the same move back to science to justify the claim. Gene expression, microbiome shifts, stress chemistry, all of it in days. 7 days is the number that really lands like a punch. Because that turns the whole thing from mystical fluff into an experiment. I mean, that is also where people get suspicious, and fair enough. Like, is it the meditation, the structure, the belief, or the person finally committing? Probably all of it, and that is what makes it messy and interesting. He keeps saying change is not a lecture, it is a state shift. Which is rude because lectures are so much easier to sell. Seriously, though, you cannot just explain somebody out of their nervous system. That part hit me because it is exactly what friends and partners try to do. You see the pattern, you love them, and you start acting like a tiny therapist. A tiny therapist with terrible boundaries and a lot of confidence. And his answer is basically, help them change state before you try to change meaning. Do something with them, move them, break the trance, give them a different emotional channel. That is actually a kinder idea than arguing with them. It is also way more realistic because emotion is the gatekeeper here. He is saying new information cannot land if the emotional state rejects it, which is a little bleak but also explains every bad conversation ever. Wait, that is actually the truth of family dinners. The other huge idea is the survival state, because he treats stress like a kind of cultural disease. Fear, competition, resentment, control, all of that becomes a default operating system. And then people call that normal, which is the saddest part. He is basically saying normal is not healthy just because it is common. And when the body stays in emergency mode, it starts treating that as balance. That is the horror movie line in this whole thing. Because then your thoughts are not just thoughts, they are chemical commands. So if thinking about your problems can make you sick, then thinking differently is not a slogan. It becomes the actual work of recovery, or at least the attempt at it. Imagine being addicted to your own worst day. That is such a brutal way to say it, but yes, that is the loop. What I like is that he does not stop at diagnosis and just leave people there. He keeps pushing toward rehearsal, repetition, and actual structure. Wake up, do not grab the phone, sit still, choose the day before the day chooses you. That is the most expensive advice in the world because it costs attention. And attention is the one thing everybody thinks they have until they do not. He is also very clear that the first step is new information. Not because information alone fixes you, but because it removes doubt. I will give him that because belief often dies in the gap between wanting and trusting. And that is why the mirror talk stuff feels too thin to him. Just telling yourself you are rich while your nervous system is screaming is comedy. It really is manifestation cosplay if there is no real internal shift. He wants the decision to be bigger than the body, bigger than the environment, bigger than time. That is dramatic, but it does make change feel like a line you cross, not a vibe you wish for. And the line crossing is what becomes memorable, because pain or urgency finally makes it real. Which is sad, but also explains why people wait until they are cornered. He is basically saying if you keep rehearsing the old self, do not be shocked when it returns. And if you practice the new self enough, the new self starts to feel familiar. Familiar is doing a lot of work in this episode, honestly. That is the hidden tragedy and the hidden hope at the same time. Because the thing that keeps pulling you back can also be retrained. Slowly, annoyingly, repeatedly, like any actual skill. Which is probably the least sexy answer and the most useful one. All right, that is the core of this episode for me. Next time, we get into what happens when the old self fights back. And that part gets even messier, so I will see you there. For now, just sit with the idea that the loop can be interrupted. Episode 3 is where the resistance shows up and starts talking back.